Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. Another presentation of Non-Linear Existentialism, this time Aristotle, Virtue, Happiness, and Well-Being, the Highest Good. In this presentation, teleology is basically the idea of final cause, initial or final cause. And I wanted to bring this up because when I had my previous presentation, that we brought up the idea of references, and I think that this goes hand in hand with it, and one of the best people to discuss for the idea of cause or final cause was given by Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics. And through this we will try to show how it's the good points and the bad points and how it relates to non-linear existentialism and how some of the inconsistencies that appear to be apparent in Aristotle's arguments might be served through the theories that are given by non-linear existentialism. So basically the first idea is teleology is the idea of cause, or final cause, or reason for something to occur. And for Aristotle, he looks at not just the formal and the efficient causes, but also the final cause. The final purpose for doing something. Some people might say that this is to live a good life, to serve God. It depends on the perspective, of course. And for non-linear existentialism, it's always been argued towards a residual incongruencies equal to zero or reaching zero. Different perspective. Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics. With this one, we have also the interesting idea of what happiness is, and also if you look at the second definition, they also say that perhaps eudaimonia, the Greek word, should not be translated per se as being happy, but perhaps well-being. And this is something else that's going to be addressed in this presentation. So, initial concerns questions is what is happiness? It is a relatively vague term, but for Aristotle, as I show in the direct quotations from his work, is that everything, the final cause, the greatest good, is happiness. And the question is, what is happiness? And happiness is different for different people, but because everyone goes towards happiness, his theory is that that's why people go, what their final drive towards something is to be happy. It's hard to argue, but as you'll see in the further presentation, I think there's going to be more of a, make it less abstract. Is it positives and sensations? What are these? That will be answered hopefully later on. How do you measure this concept? Abstraction. The other one is circular reason. As you will see in the quotations from Aristotle, basically says a virtuous person is happy because they are virtuous. This, of course, is circular reasoning. The other concern is that if happiness is a good thing and to be happier is considered even better, wouldn't that lead to a positive feedback loop? And because if you have too much happiness, like with anything else, that can be self-destructive. So these are Aristotle's words. As many times as I can, I will always take it directly from the translation from Terence Irwin of 1985. And what he basically says through this, and you can read it at your own leisure, is that a best political system, political science is considered one of the better sciences because it can bring about happiness through making sure that the citizens are doing the right thing. If they become virtuous, they will be good people, and good people will be happy. Seems a relatively simple argument, but in terms of non-linear existentialism, as addressed in previous presentations, that would make sense if the external references can be brought in and made internal references, and those match, then the person is being congruent with their environment, and that possibly can lead to reduced incongruencies and lead to happiness. So as a secondary thing, I do believe in some of the arguments that Aristotle does make. Other ones is, just please read this at your own leisure, a clear account of the good, human soul's activity expressing virtue. One of the key aspects or drives or purposes of the human soul is to bring about virtue. Human soul working properly will bring about virtue, and a good virtue will lead about to happiness in the person who's happy and has had a fulfilled life. Having found a first principle, we should not demand a further principle beyond it. This is something we bring up later on. Basically, what Aristotle is saying is if our first principle is that happiness is the best or first good, we should not question it and just should move on. But I'm going to be questioning that later on, so look forward to that. How is happiness acquired? Happiness is acquired by virtue. And again, please read at your own at your own rate. And one other thing important here is that virtue is a stabilizing system for an individual. And this is kind of distressing here. 1.81 basically was saying that an animal or a child cannot have happiness. He doesn't go into it so much, and he basically says that if they are displaying any happiness, it is not real happiness, and that's something I'm also going to be talking about later as well. And more on going on into specifics and building his argument, sometimes on good premises, on others somewhat questionable. And so it's going to rational, non-rational aspects. Again, this is just background to build into the argument. And the other thing is that virtue is brought about not by something being given to a person as they're born. He believes in basically a blank slate as well. His idea is through habituation, through learning. So an individual doesn't have virtue moment one. They learn it, and when they learn it, then they can become happy. So it kind of gets to the idea of what he was talking about before. A child has not learned virtue, so therefore they cannot be happy. Although that is quite a questionable conclusion. Pleasure and pain. Another important thing with this one is that he's bringing up the idea of the intermediate condition, and you'll be seeing this later on. Basically, what he's believing with the intermediate condition is that virtue works best when it's intermediate between the extremes. So if his idea is that it appears very much like I've argued before with a negative feedback loop, that you would have an intermediate condition. The amount of neuronal stimulation in the cerebral cortex is a driving mechanism, of course, for non-linear existentialism and increasing it towards its previous condition. For him, it seems to be very much the same, and I'll show you the diagram later on, that basically virtue is modulating back and forth above and below a basic baseline of happiness. And if the virtue is not working correct, the happiness can be too much or too little, and he believes in the idea of temperance. So that it goes to the idea more towards well-being as a standardized state. So definition of virtue. Virtue then is a state that decides, B, consisting of the mean relative to us, which is defined by reference to reason. Again, this goes back to the idea of reasons being brought about through society, so internal reference to external references, i.e. to reason by reference to which the intelligent person would define it. It is a mean between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Very similar to what I just mentioned. Then he also describes it being a voluntary action. Again, the idea of non-linearism, that the thing is that if a person was connected to the environment, a complete connection and complete dependence, then there should be no such thing as voluntary action. But to Aristotle, an ethical act can only be ethical if it's voluntary, if a person can choose between right and wrong. Again, there's quite a lot of similarities with non-linear existentialism. And again, it goes to the idea that it originates in us. So it's not from external, it's from internal. So going back to kind of thoughts that I had of these previous quotations, virtue has been theorized to be a stabilizing force for the development of happiness. However, if, as stated in 2, virtue is learned through habituation and virtue is responsible for happiness, the following may be true. Virtue may be in a suboptimal condition until learning is effective because, B, it is not able to maintain an intermediate state of happiness. Based on this, C, happiness once it occurs after childhood, as he said, could be in a decline for a period of time. That, I think, is very important, because if you take his arguments, it implies that, because you can't believe that virtue would be working the process, the negative feedback loop of virtue would, from the moment that happiness occurs, would be in an optimal condition. That it seems reasonable that it would actually start happiness to decrease. So does this also imply that once virtue has been learned and it is an effective process, this then stops the decline of happiness? And second, if the process of virtue continues to improve, does this cause happiness to keep it at a plateau level, or perhaps cause it to increase? Something that has to be taken from his arguments and carried forward. Also, is the initial inability to be virtuous, 1.81 in his arguments, only a result of having to learn to be virtuous, or is it the lack of virtuousness a result of being also in a conflict with the environment. Non-linear existentialism brings that point up. Perhaps this is a byproduct of being non-linear with it and not having the ability to cope with the conflict during this time period. So as a person is being formed, their own linearity with the outside world leads to forms of anxiety has been addressed before, and these incongruencies cause the level of happiness to decrease. So in 3.18 and 3.41, voluntary actions and the ability to be responsible for action requires actions to originate in the person. So overview, virtue being the phrase that Aristotle used in non-linear feedback loop, very similar. They achieve a intermediate or mean state. Action behaviors are related to each other and achieve a singular goal, that being at a level of energy which should be increasing towards a previous state. So again, happiness, positive feedback loop. So we have an intermediate mean state. There's a linkage to the soul is described for, it is described in a way for both Aristotle's work in non-linear existentialism, whereas for non-linear existentialism, it's more of V1B of the cerebral cortex that is supposed to house what be considered the soul. Aristotle mentions the soul, but he doesn't really flesh it out per se. And then you have does not discuss if level changes, does discuss if level changes. So for Aristotle, it seems to imply sometimes that they can change the level of happiness with an individual. But the thing is that it doesn't directly say that, but of course for non-linear existentialism, that's one of the key elements of it. Starts high, goes low, goes back up high again. So again, there seems to be a very strong connection when it comes to negative feedback loop as it is to virtue, and the implication of a positive feedback loop is certainly there as well. And this I want to give a schematic. So you look at this flat line. First, you have age and level of happiness. So you go along, there's nothing until there's that point, which is supposed to be after childhood for Aristotle. And you have this straight line that, if you look at the idea of happiness, is that the system virtue, the green line going back and forth of the negative feedback, is trying to keep it along that line through virtue. If something happens to the individual, this line can go down. So this is more of an excellent person maintaining excellence. Then we got the question of previous what we saw. We can consider that A line, the flat horizontal line. Then ask ourselves, B, perhaps that because, and this does make sense, I believe, that if the ability to be virtue is through habituation, and the person becomes more virtuous through more and more habituation, that you would think that this would increase the amount of happiness. That would be B. But then it goes to the idea that there needs to be a limit. If there's no limit, then the system can break down. C is kind of an asymptotic idea that yes, virtue does increase, and the process becomes better able, so it increases the line and increases the line until it reaches a point where the ability to gain happiness from the environment by being virtue reaches a stable point. But then you go with the idea of non-linear existentialism, and the X you do see here is previous from X, where it goes up a way towards C, but then the idea of line D basically is not goes up as steadily as C. It's more of a stable line, and it's brought about by a virtual system that it kind of it doesn't cause as much fluctuation at the ends, whereas in the middle, where there's more incongruency, or the incongruency is trying to settle out, the amount of virtual tendencies or negative feedback in the middle is going to be a lot higher than at the ends, and that would actually smooth out the slope as opposed to what you see in C. And the orange line that goes back from the central condition is the implication that for non-linear existentialism, that we started at a state that there was no incongruencies, and as incongruencies came into the system, that we went from a system that basically had no patterns to a system that's laden with patterns, but because there's no mechanism, the ability, the references external haven't come internal, that's led to a lot of conflict, anxiety between the patterns, and also there's always going to be the non-patterned anxiety because of the way that the frequency and amplitude modulation brings about the inherent amount of incongruency. So you can just see the two comparisons, and I think when they're compared side by side, non-linear existentialism probably makes a little bit more sense. I would think so. So the idea of the setting a maximum level of happiness and bringing the idea of well-being that was brought in by Encyclopedia Britannica, that if happiness, well-being are a reflection of their cerebral energy state, and this energy state has an upper sustainable level, sustainability is very important, it should be proposed that the highest energy state would occur in the early stages of life before negative effects of incongruency, which is a byproduct of being non-linear to the environment, as is required by involuntary actions, can form in the cerebral cortex. That if you are non-linear with the environment, that this will cause conflict. And the thing is that the more you interact with the environment before having references in order to deal with this conflict, it's going to cause more and more incongruencies. So this one is well-being as defined by non-linear existentialism. Basically the idea that well-being is going to be the idea of a chronically amendable state. It's going to be, again, very close to what happiness was referred to as beforehand, but it's going to be a stable energy state within the cerebral cortex. And if you're going to be internally self-centered, it's going to be leading to more incongruencies because you are more out of step with the environment. And if you're externally centered, that your references are more congruent with external references, so that leads to less incongruencies, and the level of well-being can increase, or at least be stable. So theoretical relationship between well-being, chronic, and happiness is acute. A virtuous person creates well-being in the society they affect and are affected by because they are able to create well-being in themselves. Happiness could be referred to imply a momentary or conscious realization of this condition. So you have well-being, and that's a stable state. So if something comes up and you realize how good your well-being is, that achieves happiness because of its awareness. So that's what I think kind of differentiates the two. Again, perhaps well-being as represented as a level of energy within the cerebral cortex is not moving towards a new or different state within the person, but is actually the recovery or re-establishment of original preset condition that is inherently more stable and sustainable. The desire to reach this state could be what gives well-being its ability to bring about action. This could give an origin of happiness well-being that was not offered by Aristotle. Again, with 1.63, he just said happiness is an obvious, or Eumenian is an obvious thing that we want to go towards that should be not argued. Non-linear existentialism goes a little further than that because it is a physical based theory. It's saying that we had a high energy state in the cerebral cortex, and through interactions in the environment that decreased, and once internal references have lower conflict, then the previous energy level can be brought back towards. So it isn't an unlimited system, it's just going back to a previous condition. It at one time looks like it's negative feedback, virtue going around the level of well-being, and it's positive at the same time because it's always trying to go back to that original state. So it's positive and it continually pushes against it, and the reason why it has to continually push against it because almost from moment one conflict is being brought into the system until it can stabilize and assert itself to reduce that. So conclusion. One whose internal references are in the most agreement with external references that are celebrated by the society in which they communicate with and are affected by are considered to be virtuous and are most likely to have well-being and experience happiness. Number two, however, since well-being happiness is only a byproduct of this agreement, and because this does not necessarily imply that true virtue has been achieved, a person can have well-being and happiness and not be virtuous. Something very important to think about. The level of well-being in a person is stabilized by virtue begins at an initial high level of energy, if I can use that term, then is reduced to a lower energy level through incongruency. You can have pattern and non-pattern. And then through efforts of the person, the system endeavors to return to its initial pre-incongruent energy level. I thank you very much. I know this is a lot of information, but I thought when I was reading Nicomachean Ethics, there was a lot of similarity between non-linear existentialism and also with Nicomachean Ethics. First, of the idea of that virtue and its a relationship with happiness, well-being, but also underlining that is a question of a positive feedback loop occurring at the same time. Again, I can't possibly understand his thought patterns beyond what was written, but the implications certainly be there. But I thank you very much for your time. I know this is a lot, but I think that is something that had to be addressed at this point in this series because Aristotle is one of the fathers of philosophy, of course, and a lot of our philosophical ideas, at least in the Western culture, have been brought about through him. And I think that it needs to have some more parallelisms drawn between a physical-based system, non-linear existentialism, and his, which are more theoretical, and see how congruent they are. But I thank you very much for your time. Take care.